I'd like to welcome everybody to the third episode of our Integration Down Under. We're trying to stick to our schedule. This talk, I've been meaning to do this talk for a while because I've done some work with a client here in Melbourne around doing unit and isolated integration tests. And I don't know whether it's me or I've just made it up, but I like the term isolated integration tests. So, okay, so who I am. I'm a cloud and platform and API evangelist for SixPivot. I've been a Microsoft MVP since 2004. Was BizTalk, then Microsoft Integration in Azure. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, a Microsoft certified solution expert in cloud platform and infrastructure, and I've been the organizer for the Melbourne Global Integration Bootcamp for 2017 and 2018. So what we're going to do in this talk tonight, we're going to talk about BizTalk unit and isolated integration testing, and I'm doing a little bit different spin on this. You can do some of this unit testing and things like that in BizTalk out of the box. I have to admit the schema, the map, and the pipeline testing that comes out of the box with BizTalk is not the easiest stuff to use. And so one of the ideas that I've done in the stuff that I've built is to make that easier. So I'm using for this testing, I'm using a combination of stuff. I'm using a combination of the BizTalk deployment framework. So that helps me do a few things. And I've got a piece I want to show you tonight that I only discovered a couple of years ago, and it's a really neat feature of BTDF. I'm also using SpecFlow. Now, the reason I got involved in SpecFlow when I was working at Mexia, they were using it for some non-BizTalk unit testing, and it basically I think it's based on the Cucumber language, and it's a human readable test definition. So we'll look at that. And to support my SpecFlow tests, I've built a BizTalk testing framework. Now, I can't take 100% credit for that because basically I took some of this from some code I got from Michael Stevenson over in the UK, that he had built some BizTalk testing framework for HL7. So what I've done is I've kind of extended it outside the HL7 realm into pretty much standard BizTalk. And we'll talk about some unit testing. So basically that's those tests. The only one I've implemented at the moment is the map test for the particular customer I was working for. That really is the one that really makes a difference. And then I'll also talk about isolated integration testing. And so basically what we want to do is start off with BizTalk deployment framework. I know some people aren't using BizTalk deployment framework. It's now moved over to GitHub. It was on Codeplex. It will deploy pretty much all of your BizTalk resources and allows you to even do some modifications and things like that. And the big one that it has for me is it has an environment settings. So I can have different settings for each environment I want to deploy to, and I can also hook that into either Octopus deploy, or I can hook it into VSTS's release management, things like that. That's another talk. Now, here is the kicker, that binding files can have ifdefs. Now, why this is important to BizTalk is that, okay, in my development environment, do I want to have to set up an FTP server so that I can test my FTPs? Probably not. So one of the things I can do with that ifdef in the binding file is I can have the same binding file work for all of my environments, but I can have certain ports show up as file instead of FTP in my development environment and my build environment. And I also, this has always been a challenge, is that if I've got, say in a production environment, I've got a request response port, it's a two-way. So I can't just override it with file because I can't I can't do any parameterizing in BTDF or anything that makes that work. So basically the ifdef, and I'm going to show you some good examples of that. The reason I wouldn't use BTDF if it's a very simple solution. I mean, if I don't have any of the extra stuff like BAM or BRE or things like that, I might just use the standard BizTalk. The only downfall to that is if I want automated build support in something like TeamCity, or if I want automated build support in VSTS, I have to build those tasks that will package the DLLs and things like that. There is a couple of tools. I think I'm trying to remember. There is a tool that somebody's put together out there that will create the MSI, but I always like to deploy it in the BizTalk as part of it. So that's a little bit different. You need to do that on your own. And again, if you wanted to do everything in PowerShell, you might want to do it outside of BTDF. So here's what the ifdefs will do for us. Allows different port configurations in different environments. So I can have a file in dev and test and FTP in UAT in production. I can have extra archiving, and this has been really helpful on a project I'm working on here in Melbourne, is that basically in production, we don't want to archive all these files coming back from their warehouse management system. But on dev and test, I definitely do, because that allows me, and UAT, is it allows me to see what came back from the warehouse management system that might have caused the map to fail and things like that when we're doing testing. And another one that I haven't used as much, but I was looking at it the other night, is different tracking configurations. I mean, I could parameterize that. One of the things you'll see in my examples is I'll also show you that if you've got the ESB portal exception management framework and you want to capture your exceptions into the ESB management the exception framework, you may want to do that on UAT in production, but you probably don't want to do it on your dev environment because you go off hunting for where your exception message went to and things like that. So I'll show you some configuration in there that allows you to do that. So this is one of the pieces that you might need to use. You'll see this is a SYN pipeline, and this is the data for a SYN pipeline. So if I've got some configuration in there, this is an archiving component that we've got. And basically what I want to do, you'll see that dollar open paren server name close paren, and that's a value coming from my environment settings. And sometimes to make that work with the rest of these ifdefs, you need to wrap that ifdef XML preprocessor. So basically that causes the XML preprocessor to process that line, replace the server name. The reason it doesn't work sometimes is because it's in a escaped XML string. So you'll see that less than semicolon, and it's in an escaped XML string. I've had trouble. It didn't want to replace those with the BTDF replacement. So you need to use that ifdef XML preprocessor. This is the one that I was talking about a second ago. This basically allows me to say, if my BizTalk environment is dev, then I want to turn off the failed message routing. Otherwise, I want to turn it on. Now, this is not magic. This BizTalk environment is something that I need to pass in. So if you go look at, and we'll look at my environment settings in the demo, you'll see that I have a BizTalk environment defined in the environment settings so that you'll be able to use that in the ifdefs to be able to process things. This is, when I first looked at it, I couldn't figure out what this was doing when I first went to this customer that was using it. And once I started looking at it, it's got some really neat power. The next example I've got here is, say I want to have an audit record, and I only want to do it on all the non-production environments. So I can actually add a SYN port that only gets deployed in non-production environments. So basically, that allows me to do that. Now, one of the other things I'll show is you could have that just at the primary transport, So if one of them, if my non-production one wants to be file, and then my production one wants to be FTP, I could just have two primary transport sections with ifdefs wrapped around them. So let's go and hop over to our the machine that I've got here for my demos. So basically, if we go over here, you should be seeing my machine now. We'll go up here to my deployment. We'll go up into my, we'll look at the BizTalk deployment framework first, and I'll show you where I'm getting that BizTalk environment. So basically, properties from environment settings. That will allow you to, it basically makes those variables available inside of this BTDF file. So that's the first piece you have to have. Then there's also some pieces here where you, let's see, require XML preprocessor directives and basically use the master bindings file. So those are the two things that have to be turned on. And then we'll go look at the binding file. So basically we get past all of the wonderful stuff at the top. We can go here. This was that example I showed you a minute ago. And then basically what we could do is we could take that and wrap that around this primary transport. So this primary transport is SFTP. So if on the other environments that we don't want to have SFTP, we could have another primary. So basically what we would do is, let's see, just grab that real quick, go down here and say, and basically make that equal to prod. And then what I do is I'll put the else at the end of the primary transport. And then I can grab, say this, actually, let's go down here and find that audit port. I know that is a, let's go find that guy. There we go. This is the primary transport just for a file location. Go back up there and find that SFTP. There we go. Go in there and drop that primary transport in there. Drop in the ifdef after that primary transport. And so now basically I could go in there, and if I wanted to, I could make the file name. I could make it something like, just change that to SFTP. And then I might want to also keep the SFTP file name. So basically I could grab that and just throw that into there. So now basically on all non-production environments, you would have that going out to a file as opposed to going out to a SFTP location, because basically having to set SFTP up on everybody's development machine and things like that can be a bit overwhelming and a bit painful at best. So that's, I'm going to pop up a quick poll and just ask a question about BTDF. So you can just respond to that. So yeah, it looks like that we have pretty much 100% of the people are using BTDF, which is good. Now, I don't have a poll for it, but it'd be interesting to know how many people. Actually, I'll just let me just create a real quick, and that's not going to let me create it real quick. So, but basically, let me just create a new poll real quick while we're here, and say how many people new used Okay. And so let me just go in there. So how many people used the ifdefs? And let me launch that poll. Okay, so that's good. So there was 30% using it and 70% not. So it's a good one. Hopefully people would get a little bit out of that. So basically you can put those anywhere in there. Like I said, you do have to use that the ifdef XML preprocessor if you want to manipulate these lines where you've got kind of embedded XML in those lines. It seems to work fine, and this is an interesting one. It seems to work fine for these kinds of replaceables, but not the ones that are embedded in XML. And it just may have been the way I was doing it, but it's worth having a try at that. Okay, so let's hop back to the slides. So that's a bit of a demo of BTDF and the ifdefs. Now, we're going to move on to SpecFlow. And I guess that's another one is, oh, let me close that poll, sorry. Okay, now the other one is, I'm going to pop another poll up about unit testing. So let me just pop that up there now. So how many people are using unit testing with their BizTalk? Okay, so that's good. Opposite of the ifdefs, so we had 70% using it and 30% no. So what I'm hoping is that maybe this will give that other 30% and those 70% that are already using it some little easier ways to do some of this. So basically, SpecFlow gives us the ability to do human readable test syntax. It's free. If you want the spec runner, which gives you a little bit more detailed report of the test results, that is chargeable, but you don't need to use that. Gives you, and basically everything in SpecFlow is designed as steps, and we'll see those in a minute. And then basically you can have parameters and tables. It's also integrated into Visual Studio, so you can run your SpecFlow test inside of Visual Studio. So this is a sample SpecFlow feature file. So basically the feature I'm testing here is just process one, and I have created a lot of these steps. So the first one I've created here is given the system is in a clean state. At the moment, all that really does is, okay, hold on, let me see. Let me just check somebody. Can you see it now? Okay, so let me just check and see. Sorry, is that better? Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why that popped off that screen like that. Okay, sorry. So basically, this is a sample feature file from SpecFlow. What you'll see is, given the system is in a clean state. So I wrote that code. It's code in a .NET helper for SpecFlow, and it goes out and looks at BizTalk. The only thing it does at the moment, I haven't actually implemented the code that will go out and clean up any suspended messages or anything like that. But basically what it'll do, it sets a timestamp of the latest tracking record when this test starts and the latest event log that when this starts. So then I can check later on to see if there's been any tracking data or any errors, any suspended messages, things like that inside of BizTalk. Then it basically goes in there and says, there is an inbound message to process, and this is the name of the message. And it's basically in a test data folder in my test project. And it is included as an embedded resource in the test DLL so that I can find it no matter what build server I'm running on or anything like that. I don't have to worry about pathing to it. Then basically I say there is an inbound message to be sent to BizTalk, and it goes on this port name with application BizTalk. I'll show you the app.config file where this is kept. Then it basically says BizTalk will receive a message on this port. BizTalk will send a message on this port, and there will be no suspended messages in BizTalk application, that application name, and you can put a comma and have multiple application names. And then there will be no errors in the application event log. Now, something I've just added recently is there will be output. So that makes sure that there's a file. And then it allows me to use XPath to see if I've got a customer name field in that output. So I'm able to actually go in there and look at the output and do some checking of it mapped correctly and things like that. So let's go to next one. One thing you do have to do, include a Testsettings.testsettings file. And what that allows is when it's running in the automated build tool, so like TeamCity or VSTS, it knows where to find the test framework DLLs and the SpecFlow DLLs, and I'm doing a little bit of XML differencing. So basically that's what I'm using. I just need to have that in my project. So let's hop off to the machine again. Now, I'm assuming everybody can still see the screen. Okay. So what I want to do is that I'll go down here quickly and we'll look at the feature file. And so down here in my test project, I have features. And the first one of those is a map test. So basically, it looks very similar to that other one, but what it does this time is it doesn't actually push a message through BizTalk. It just executes the map test like a unit test would in a normal BizTalk unit test. But what I've wrapped that in the SpecFlow so that I don't have to code all that stuff. So basically, I'm able to go in there and look at that. So I got the inbound file, and you'll see here in my test data, I have that XML file, and it's an embedded resource. And then basically, I'm going to apply the inbound to order map from this DLL. It's got input type XML, output type XML, and whether you're validating the input and the output. I should have those validations turned on. Then basically it says the map will produce output, and then I can run these XPaths so that there's one header and one detail in that map. This is the other one I showed you a minute ago, and this is just that one that we looked at. Now I have added a few things to that. I'll just show you here, there's integration in Visual Studio. So if you go up here to the tools, extension and updates, the installed ones, you'll see there is a SpecFlow for Visual Studio 2015 that gives you SpecFlow support inside of Visual Studio. So that allows you to go here and say, close that and go here and say, add a new item and a SpecFlow feature file. And they've got different language supports too. Now, so what we want to do now, that's kind of just a little bit about SpecFlow. I also can do, if I go here and go run SpecFlow scenario, and I can also do a debug SpecFlow scenario. We'll do a little bit of that later on. So I want to hop back to the slides. Now, let me just make sure, the screen stayed shared, which is good. So now what we want to do is we want to talk about this BizTalk testing framework. And so basically, it's a requirement for using my test project, and it's referenced by a NuGet package. So I build this testing framework and generate a NuGet package, and then I consume that NuGet package. The other thing I need is I need a SharedSteps.cs file in my test project. And what that allows me to do is to keep from having to code everything in the test project. So it was an easy way to get around coding everything in the test project. So what this does, it does a couple of little tricks. You set a reference to the map DLL up in your map project, and then you pick out the currently executing assembly and store it as a SpecFlow context variable. And you do the same thing for your shared steps, for your map DLL. So it puts it into a map list of reference DLLs so that you can find it later on. Because what I want to do is I want to have all of my step definitions and things like that for my features in that testing framework so that I don't have to have them every time. So let's look at the code. So let's go back and spend a little time looking at the first thing I'll show you is in my app.config, I've got some pieces in here where I define my BizTalk send ports and receive ports that I used. The big thing is up here, I define the sections. So here's where the section handler, so that's my BizTalk testing framework utility. And the one that I had trouble with at first is this one here that says, look for SpecFlow steps in this DLL. So look for SpecFlow steps. So that lets you use referenced assemblies to contain your SpecFlow steps. Okay, that's pretty much what is in your project. So your test project basically has the feature files, the test data, and a shared steps one, and an app.config. And you'll see that shared steps is exactly what I showed you, just as a reference up to there. Now we want to go look at the test framework. So what I've got in here, it's just a C# assembly. And basically, I've got a NuGet package definition in here that picks up all the files I need. And then I've got the SpecFlow DLL that has a big set of shared steps. Now, you remember that one in the previous, where we were looking at the systems in a clean state? So what that does is it goes in, sets up a logger, and it goes over and it calls get last message tracking date time and application event log get last event date and time. It puts those into the scenario context. Actually, let me hop back to that other project just real quick because I want to show you where it runs that. If we go here to our test, you'll see that get scenario context. That's what causes this shared steps to run, because it's basically runs before scenario context. So that's what sets up all of those references. And then basically, and let's go back to here. So what this is doing, it's going off to that. And I've got some helpers up here. And let me get rid of the reference list here. And so here's the tracking helper. And basically get last tracking date and time. It goes off, it finds BizTalk via the registry key, opens up a connection to the database, goes and does a SQL query, and does a date time. Now, I did have problems with this because I needed to convert the date time into a string when it comes back from SQL. Otherwise, it was doing funky stuff with the time zone and things like that. So it should be the string's coming back as a UTC date and time. So that anytime I compare it, I need to compare it to a UTC date and time. So that, and then I've got my event log helper. So basically goes out and reads the event log and basically says, okay, get my last event log date and time. So basically goes into the application log, finds the newest entry, grabs that date and time, saves that off in a context variable. So then I go back to my shared steps. I've got a whole bunch of these things in there. And now what I want to do is I need to update this one and add something that will go out there and go clean up any suspended instances. Because this is designed to be run on your dev machine. This is designed to be run on a build server. So you shouldn't really care about suspended instances on a build server. So, and then basically you go down through here, and I've got a bunch of things in here, and I've added some stuff recently I wanted to show you. I've added some stuff around basic HTTP. So basically I've got the ability in there now to send a message. And you'll notice that I can put variables in those step definitions, and they come in there as a file type, and then they come in as the table. So there's some really neat stuff in there around being able to do that. And so basically that will go off, and it will use a basic HTTP through my utilities. And basically this is the piece that allows me to read the port definitions, and then basically it can write out that. And then basically it takes the response that comes back from that HTTP and puts it back into a context variable. And then I can go here with the next one and say, the WCF basic HTTP response code will contain. And it basically just does a string comparison that says completed or failed or whatever you wanted to do with it. So basically you can build any kind of steps that you want. If you've got particular things that you want to do, that allows, you can do that, ability to look at, do any kind of testing you want. Now, one of the things that I would love to do and love to work on soon is that if I've got something I need to mock, so if I've got a call that I need to call to a web service, and then I need to get a response back from that web service, what I'm hoping is in that scenario context, start before and after scenario context queues, I can actually spin up a web listener, let it grab the results or send the message to that listener. It will send back a response. That'll allow me to mock those web endpoints really well. So that's the next thing I really want to work on in that. There's my XPath testing, things like that. So and then I've got just some utilities here that allow me to, this is where it's reading configuration data and some logging and things like that. So let's hop back to the slides now. And make sure my, yep. So now what we want to talk about is unit testing. So I've already kind of covered a little bit of this. What comes out of the box for unit testing in BizTalk is schemas, maps, and pipelines. The only thing I've implemented so far is the mapping tests. But I think from that implementation of mapping tests, if you really wanted to do schema tests, you could actually do that pretty easily. So if there's code in there, so if we go back just really quickly and go in here and look at, I've got a unit testing DLL, and this is my piece for executing a map. So basically it's a fairly simple, and it basically writes the files out. It grabs the file out of the resource, writes it to a temp directory, creates a temp output file, and then executes the BizTalk map test. So I haven't built any brand new map tests or anything like that. Also, if you wanted to implement the pipeline testing, I think Winterdom have a pipeline testing framework. You could implement that inside of the SpecFlow tests. And I think that would be really neat to have everything inside of SpecFlow for all of those tests. Now, the good news is that, I was going to mention this later on, but I want to make these test libraries open source. I want to put them up on GitHub, and I want people to contribute so that we can build some really neat testing stuff for BizTalk in terms of making it easier for new people to get started and do proper unit testing and isolated integration testing. So I'm going to skip that. We'll go run the unit tests. So let's go here now and go back to our environment. And so the unit test is that map test. So if I go back to the project, I bring up that map test, you'll see I'm just testing a map. So what I do is I go here and I do a run SpecFlow scenario. Come on. Come on, I just need to get the output window to show up. There we go. Come on. And I didn't mean it to show up quite that big. So go use the reset Windows layout. There we go. So what it's doing, it actually does a build, and then it basically does the test, and you'll see that that map test for inbound order ran. So basically, and that's basically if I click on output, I'm still putting out a fair bit of debugging, so to make it easy to debug. You can't see it all in this window, so you have to bring it into there, and then I want to run. Just bring up a copy of Visual Studio Code. And get all of its messages away and do a file, new file, paste in there. And basically, this is all of the things that happen in the test. So this map test doesn't have too much debugging in it, but basically I've got a bunch of debug trace coming out of the test. And so let me just hide that there. So that's basically a unit test. I did run into a problem, and this is an interesting one, is that no matter what you do in this code, it insists on reading the DLLs out of the GAC. Okay? So even though you make a change and you normally can unit test as soon as you do a build, for some reason, I couldn't get around the fact that BizTalk wanted it to be GAC'd first. So in my automated build, I used to have you build the DLLs, you unit test, then you deploy into the BizTalk build server your solution, and then you do the isolated integration tests. That doesn't work because it can't find the DLL until it's been deployed into the GAC. So I had to change it to where I build it, deploy it, unit test, and isolated integration test. I don't know if there's a way around it. I spent about 3 days on it, and I finally just gave up in disgust and went on. So there might be something I missed, but I'd be interested if anybody can find that. Now, this is one of my pet ones, isolated integration tests. What that means is I'm running a message completely through BizTalk. So I'm basically dropping it in a file location, getting BizTalk to pick it up, and dropping a file out. And I can check the output, all that kind of stuff. But I shouldn't have any external systems connected. I want to run this on a build server. I want it to be repeatable every single time. In the past, I've worked with people that have written unit tests that have database connections. And what happens is they run the first time, somebody messes around with the database, adds some more data, removes some data, does something to it, and then they all fail. That doesn't really help me because it's not my code that's failing. It's the environment around my code. So I want all of my tests that run on my build server and on my dev machine to be isolated from those end systems. The client I'm working on right now, they've got Oracle, so I really don't want Oracle running on my BizTalk box so that I can mock out the tests. And typically, there's no need to set up FTP and things like that. It should be file, because with the ifdefs in the BizTalk deployment framework, I can get that. What I am working on now is adding some steps to the SpecFlow that will spin up file listeners and things like that, where I don't have to have something deployed on that environment. I want to be able to spin up a web listener and let it just respond to things and be able to handle those kind of calls. Haven't got to that point yet, but hopefully I will get to that point soon. So that's basically my isolated integration tests. So basically, let's go look at those tests. And let me make sure I've got the screen still there. Yep, okay. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to run this test. And basically that's going to go out into BizTalk. And let's set up a little bit of proof here. Let's go look at my group hub. Let's go look at the tracked messages. So I have a tracked message. The last one I have is 4/11. So that's yesterday. So let's go into here. Let's go and we run the SpecFlow scenario. For some reason, it insists on doing a build every time. There's probably some flag that I've missed out there that can be fixed that it doesn't. So basically, it's doing a quick build. And just let me bring up that feature file. So basically, we're going to go out there. We're going to grab that input file. We're going to send it in through a port. Then we're going to receive an output through that. We're going to pick that output file up, and we're going to do an XPath expression against it. Okay, test is finished. We see here, there's my output. It worked. Now, just to prove that it's all not smoke and mirrors, let's change that, and let's save that file. Let's run the SpecFlow test again. Because tests that always run and don't fail probably don't do a whole lot of good. So it's basically doing the build again. And SpecFlow has got a unit test runner that is MS Test. So you can do this in your automated builds and any of that type of stuff that you want to. One of the things I haven't done yet is trying to do like your smoke tests with SpecFlow. Should be able to do that the same way. Aha, it failed. So basically it said message expected to, actually one, there should be one customer name. So there should be one customer name. That's where that ties it back to. Now let's go and look at the output. And this time I will have to do a copy all and go out here to Visual Studio Code, do a file, new file. So I got a lot of stuff going on in this basically because what happens is it goes out and gets the tracking date and time. And then once the message is pushed into BizTalk, so there's copying my file into the right directory. And then basically it starts querying BizTalk to see if it's received a message. So it's looking for the process 1N port to make sure, and it keeps polling, and it does kind of a exponential back off on that, so that basically sometimes it just takes a while. And then it does the same thing looking for the message on the out port. Now, you do have to have tracking turned on these. So I ran into a problem, and if you're familiar with BizTalk 2016, when you do an install, a couple of the default pipelines don't have tracking turned on in them. So you just need to turn on in your binding files, you just need to make sure tracking's turned on to those pipelines. And then basically it goes out there and it finds the message and then basically executes. So here's where it found, no, that's the debug. That's what it's going to do. Let's see if I've got it to where it found the file with a GUID in it. So in my app.config, I set up what that file is going to look like, what directory it's going to be in. And in this one, you can have a prefix and a suffix. So the suffix is star.xml. I could have a prefix if I've got a bunch of files being dropped. But one of the things I do is I do clean out that directory before it starts. So it basically deletes the files that are in that directory to start with and goes through there. You probably don't need this much detail in the debugging, but it is just handy to be able to do that. So let's go back to the slides. Make sure I'm on the screen. Okay. So basically what I want to talk about a little bit is the futures. So basically I'm going to GitHub open source that. I wasn't sure whether I was going to, and Martin asked a question about whether it's going to be on the community GitHub repo or not. I think I might put it on mine to start with, just to get used to doing it, and then we can move it over to the other one if we need to. And I also was trying to figure out a way to do a public NuGet package. So, because that might be worthwhile. I know, like a person that does the Newton JSON stuff, you just basically consume that the NuGet package. So it would be interesting for people to just give me some feedback, just either through Twitter, it's at BizTalk Bill on the Twitter, on whether you think it would be valuable to have a NuGet package that you could just reference, or whether you're going to end up making changes to the source where you wanted an open source where you can, worst case, you can copy the source down, do whatever you want to it, add your own tests to it, and do it like that. So that would be interesting to see. And also, I'm really interested in what other people think we need, that needs to be added to that, in terms of, I've got some HTTP now. Most of the testing I've done for the particular client that I built most of this for is just straight files, because they're normally receiving things through HTTP or through FTP and sending it out through FTP. So it was just easier for the testing just to use standard file. And basically, the way I've designed it, I don't care what build engine you use, because I don't count on any local file directories. That I do count on the file in the app.config for the tests. I do count on some directories, but in the actual where it's finding your test data and all that kind of stuff, the test data is just included in your test DLL, and that never goes past your build server, so that doesn't get part of your BizTalk MSI. So I don't have to worry about how big that is. So I can put it. I've got one client solution for this current customer that's got like 60 unit tests, or 60 combination of both unit and isolated integration tests for that client, because they had problems in the past where somebody'd make a change to something and it would break another client. So I can run all of those as we need to. So now I'll open it up to, is there any other questions? Because you can use the questions window on the webinar, go to webinar and see. And then, so hopefully over the next month or so, I'm going to try to get a few of the things I wanted to do finished, and then I'll get that up on a GitHub repository, and we can start collecting some feedback. The sad thing is I'm an old TFS guy, and I've got to learn all this Git stuff with the pull requests and things like that. So I've got a little bit of learning to do. So, but I'm sure I'll get there and get that out there so that people can start leveraging in that. Okay, Wagner prefers open source instead of NuGet. That's fine. I kind of expected that, because people are going to want to add very specific things to their environment. So that makes sense. And also, I think that I'm not sure how many of your clients would want to point to a open source project in their production in their environments. They probably want to bring it down. So what I might think about doing is think about creating a NuGet package that just drops the source into your project so that you can do your own namespaces. I've done that on some other BizTalk ones, and basically you create your not BizTalk build test framework, but Dan.test framework, and then basically you run the NuGet package, and that brings the source down into your project with your namespaces and all that kind of stuff. So for Aaron, for build definition, I need a little bit more details. The actual automated builds and things like that, or what particular piece of that? I've got it set up right now. So SpecFlow, that's an interesting one. So basically SpecFlow runs, let me just hop back to the code real quick. I'll show you what you do is that in your app.config file for the test, you tell SpecFlow to basically, test provider is MS Test. So in your VSTS or TFS, you just run an MS Test and you point to this test DLL, and that's where it finds your tests. I didn't have a chance to get the VSTS automated build piece done because I decided to move it to a different VSTS repository. But I might do, in a later topic, I might do the full VSTS build and release management for BizTalk. I've done that before, I think, for the Integration Monday out of the UK, but I haven't done that on this one, so I could do that too. I do have the automated build for the, where's it at? Come on. Let's go back to my, so for my testing framework, it's, the only thing that's a little bit ugly about that is I need to build it on a machine that's got BizTalk because it uses some BizTalk DLLs for those helpers. I was very tempted to build a private NuGet package that had the 3 BizTalk DLLs that I needed. So basically it's just a NuGet install of the tools, a restore, a build the solution, and pack and push. And I'm using my BizTalk Bill repository. BizTalk Bill target feed. It's in my VSTS to do that. So I don't, I might have, let me just check and see. No, let me just look and see if I've got a build out there for that. No, I don't have a build on that one at the moment. But if you really want to see the build for that's using the testing and stuff like that, just drop me a Twitter, a direct message, or just a tweet, and I can send you some details on that. Let's just hop back to slides. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. So it was pretty good. We got, I think we had 12 people registered, and we got 11 of people on the call. So that was a pretty good turnout for the people that registered, the people that attended. So that was good. But I will also put the video of this up on the Integration Down Under YouTube site. So if people want to view this. So are there any other questions? Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. Until next month, I'll try to get a little bit sooner announcement on what next month is going to be. We tried to get Jeff Holland from the functions, but he ended up having some people in, some customers in town this week, and it was going to be like midnight for him, so he decided not to try to make it this week. So, but we will announce that far enough in advance so that more people can attend. So thank you very much. And that's all for tonight.